Let's talk about what happened to David Graeber. My hero, David Graeber. Was he leaving anarchism by the end? Or segueing toward liberalism? Was he becoming more mainstream? So this is a piece I did in the Los Angeles Review of Books, late January, um, registering my disappointment with Graeber's last book in collaboration with David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. There's a lot of it. I did find it puzzling and disappointing. And in a way, I had to read it. I had to read it twice to figure that out, to let myself feel it, because I'm a fanboy for David Graeber. I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of this book, however, even in terms of its relation to the rest of the oeuvre. All right, so let me read this essay again from Los Angeles Review of Books. What happened to David Graeber? I bow to few in my admiration for the anthropologist, economist, radical leader, and delightful prose stylist David Graeber, who died unexpectedly in 2020 at the age of 59. There might have been a certain moment where he and I were the only anarchist academics in America that I could name. I mean, I don't know if I knew Nathan June then yet and stuff. I know there are others. But I felt awful alone, or totally alone, as an anarchist by 2000. And so when I read his little book, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, I greeted it with extreme enthusiasm, especially since it talked about his experiences as an anarchist academic. And I've been telling, ever since I did run into that book, when it was published, I guess, I think I bought it at Red Emma, the bookstore in Baltimore, while I was teaching at Maryland Institute College of Art. Ever since then, I've been telling people that David Graeber is the most important anarchist theorist since Peter Kropotkin, who died in 1921. His ideas, including those beautifully captured in the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, helped motivate and shape the Occupy movement, which took inspiration from his commitments to radical democracy, egalitarianism, and prefigurative politics. The idea that people trying to make a revolution should try to live and organize now in a way they'd want to arrange their lives together in the future. We should conduct our revolution in a way that prefigures the transformed world that we want. It's the opposite of Leninism, where we're going to do to get to the world we want, we're going to use means that are precisely poised opposite that. Like violence and savage hierarchy is what's going to lead us to peace and equality. All right. Now, Graeber studied, this is a little intro to Graeber, I guess, I don't know how much intro people need. Did I envy the reception that David Graeber got? As an anarchist, a theorist who didn't get that kind of reception? Yes. On the other hand, I understood it too. And I'm not the kind of person David Graeber was. And the inspirational, joyful, loving presence that David Graeber was. And the leader that David Graeber was, okay? I'm more of a cynic. I'm more into destruction. And he's more into construction. So I don't envy him now. I just admired him like mad, really. It's not like I thought I deserved what he got. I do think that I do. A lot of philosophy professors specifically, but at any rate, he studied at the University of Chicago under Marshall Solons, who also died not so long ago, and did his anthropological fieldwork in Madagascar in the early 90s. When he returned, he published the still neglected Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value, a work of high theory, whose ambitions constitute a throwback to the eras of Marcel Mauss and Claude Lévi-Strauss. though his positions were strikingly fresh. Marcel Mauss is his all-time hero, maybe. On the strength of his early work, he got a job at Yale, and at the same time became active in the anti-globalization movement. He hated that term. He was against global capitalism, man, not the globe or going around the world or whatever, or linkages around the world. Participated in demonstrations and actions against the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and such. When he didn't get tenure at Yale, he believed that it was because of his political activities or his politics. It certainly seems plausible to me. By his own account, politically unemployable in U.S. academia, I think if he'd stuck here, maybe he would end up teaching at community college somewhere or something. He said that though the academy of that era sheltered 2000 or so, sheltered myriad authoritarian Marxists, I'll say, anarchism was considered beyond the pale, as I can confirm from personal experience. But with his remarkable energy and productivity, he landed on his feet in London, eventually scoring a richly deserved professorship at the London School for Economics. Dett continued from 2011, continued his work at the juncture of anthropology and economics that had begun with the theory of value. The two disciplines overlap, after all, in being concerned with the nature of exchange, the origin of money, and in describing structures of inequality, among other matters. The book, Debt, the Theory of Debt, the First 5,000 Years, had a remarkable reception. Never before had an anarchist been enthusiastically blurbed by the editor of the classic capitalist organ, the Financial Times. Was that Gillian Tett? Indeed, that book, and a lot of the best Graeber, has an undeniable quality. Even if you write for Bloomberg Businessweek, it turns out you're very unlikely to think the same things about money, debt, and value after you read it as you did before. You may well start to think that you are seeing these matters clearly and non-ideologically for the first time, as Graeber traverses the world's cultures and its history to watch forms of money and forms of peonage emerge. He shows that there have been many alternative possibilities for systems of exchange and value, focusing on Mauss's work on gift economies, for example. All of this in loose yet precise and swashbuckling prose, which I really admire, and all of it well documented by a serious scholar. Debt, the book, had for many a dramatic head-flipping quality, and it helped make sense of what Occupy, emerging at the same moment, was saying and what it wanted. It yielded insights into many things, but was compelling above all in giving a real history of economic hierarchy and domination, culminating in the structural and ideological predicaments of neoliberal capitalism, as each consumer blamed herself for undertaking the debt she carried throughout her life, and as the whole human world became, as though by an invisible hand, a completely unaccountable vertical power structure. People came to Occupy, for one thing, because they realized suddenly that the burden of debt they were lugging around was a structural strategy, centuries in the making, not an individual failing. The anarchism that Graeber developed across a series of protest actions and writings, including eventually the Democracy Project, the book Possibilities, a collection of papers that I really recommend, and Direct Action, an ethnography, for example, is notably contemporary and inspiring, Graeber's anarchism. Central aspects of Graeber's politics, as he framed them circa 2000 to 2015, include, quote, the rejection of the state and of all forms of structural violence, inequality, or domination. Quote, decentralized forms of consensus-based direct democracy, as developed in the Occupy encampments, but also many other places and cultures. Quote, prefigurative politics of resistance, unquote, or the claim that a non-authoritarian revolution cannot be conducted successfully by authoritarian forms of organization. Quote, rejection of permanent named leadership structures, and finally, anti-statist communism, indicating economies based around sharing or even the gift, as suggested by the anthropology of mouse, for example. All right, so that's intended to summarize David Graeber's anarchism. Those are the positions that I'm worried that he is qualifying and or abandoning or even saying are not sensible by the time you get to Dawn of Everything. It's taken a little while and repeated readings for it to sink in, but I think that Graeber was reaching the point of rejecting, or at least severely, if implicitly qualifying, almost all of these positions by late in his authorship. Should I say them again? I don't know. Rejection of the state. Decentralized forms of consensus-based direct democracy. Prefigurative politics of resistance. Rejection of permanent name leadership structures. Anti-statist communism. Particularly in On Kings from 2017, his collaboration with his mentor Solons, and The Dawn of Everything, co-written with the archaeologist David Wengrow, and completed just a couple of weeks before his death, Graeber's politics grew more mainstream in a number of respects, even as his narrative of the origin of political authority and economic hierarchy remained fresh, radical, and richly documented, and even as his prose retained its charm. But perhaps LSE professorships, FSG book contracts, and the approval of the Financial Times have moderating or even co-opting effects after all. In Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow argue that neither equality nor the state have any particular origin. Indeed, that equality and the state are not sensible or singular concepts at all. As issues in political philosophy, questions about the alleged origin of the state and the alleged origin of political inequality arose in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, they say, and they arose centrally from the challenges presented by greater contact with diverse cultures in the era of colonialism. I'm now just recapitulating the basic argument of Dawn of Everything. But these questions rested, Graeber and Wengrow argue, on a set of historically contingent, tendentious, and simplistic readings of human history by figures such as Rousseau and Turgot. Both inequality and the state, on Graeber's late view, or on late Graeber's view. I'm declaring that there's a late Graeber, who's different than mid-career Graeber, are problematic and ideological concepts, inequality in the state. Not adequately defined, perhaps not definable, not meaningful, maybe even. Hence, egalitarianism and anti-statism, insisting that these things ought to be destroyed, the state and inequality, are equally simplistic for late Graeber and equally trapped in Western conceptualities that emerged in modernity. It's not clear, to me at any rate, that one can be an anarchist who is not an egalitarian and not an anti-statist. Repudiating those two positions, by which Graeber definitely defined his politics circa 2010, amounts to repudiating the anarchist position, or else leaves you trying to define it in other terms maybe allegedly more adequate to the subtlety and complexity of power as it actually appears in real cultures. If he intended to generate such a reconstrual, Graeber hadn't quite done that work yet when his writing abruptly stopped. Now one wonders what Occupy era Graeber, the man who by his own account and many others helped formulate the slogan, "We are the 99%, might make of passages like the one below, the one I'm about to read. Its placement near the beginning of Dawn of Everything indicates that it amounts to the book's fundamental frame. It's not clear what eliminating inequality, write David would even mean. Which kind of inequality, they ask. Wealth, opportunity, exactly how equal would people have to be in order for us to say that we had eliminated inequality? How hard are these questions really? The term inequality is a way of framing social problems appropriate to an age of technocratic reformers who assume from the outset that no real vision of social transformation is possible. Debating inequality allows one to tinker with numbers, to argue about Gini coefficients and thresholds of dysfunction, readjust tax regimes or social welfare mechanisms, or even shock the public with figures that show how bad things have become. Can you imagine? The richest 1% of the world's population own 44% of the world's wealth. Here he appears to be ridiculing himself and the Occupy movement, if also Thomas Piketty. Or Graeber and Wengrow appear to be ridiculing earlier Graeber. Do I hear a touch of Friedrich Hayek here? Like, what is inequality in what dimension or whatever? But they don't take any kind of serious stab at looking at anybody's formulations of that. I mean, this is way too quick to dismiss equality as a political issue? Gots to be kidding me, man. And it's Graeber. Okay. And that's where I came up short the first time I read it. And other people have told me this too. When they hit that paragraph, they were like, all right. What was once a fundamental critique of world economic hierarchy, insisting that it has created an absurd and ever-increasing degree of differential access to resources, has become technocratic tinkering, and it's not exactly clear why. That some questions about inequality are obscure or ill-framed, inequality in what dimension, does not indicate that inequality of wealth is not a fundamental social problem. I mean, nothing in those little few rhetorical questions indicates that at all, or undergirds that position at all, that inequality is not a social problem, or I don't know what they're saying. To make sure you don't miss the centrality of this stunning turnabout, Graeber and Wengrow return to their critique of egalitarianism in their conclusion, and also to their critique of the state, the critique of the concept of the state, of the concept mind, not the thing. Late Graeber, in On Kings and Dawn of Everything, asserts again and again, in the words of the title of a long chapter, that the state has no origin. Quote, social scientists and political philosophers have been debating the origins of the state for well over a century, observe Graeber and Wengrow. These debates are never resolved and are unlikely to be. Much like the search for the origins of inequality, seeking the origins of the state is little more than chasing a phantasm. This builds on a complex analysis of social power emerging from anthropological and archaeological research, this series of observations by Graeber and Wengrow. Rejecting the classic Weberian definition of the state as a group of people who claim a monopoly of violence, Graeber and Wengrow argue that the modern state contingently combines three elements which are seen in history in very different configurations. So this is how we're going to define state now for Graeber and Wengrow. Control of violence, the Weber, control of information, and individual charisma. So the state combines those three factors, which are contingently connected. They don't have to go together, and they often haven't, actually. It's interesting. There's a number of cases they do produce along these lines that I found provisionally convincing in some ways. Okay, so the state is something that controls violence and information and leans on individual charisma simultaneously. That's where it comes from, or that's when it started. I don't know why that would have no origin, dude. Also, the way they work on this is not responsible, okay? Like, you need a political theorist, a philosopher to work on the jargon, the vocabulary that you're using here, Okay, to put these three aspects in relation to one another carefully. Okay, to compare this to other possible theories or definitions of the state, and so on. They do none of that work. This is sheer assertion, I guess, but it's undergirded by cases. But they're not cases that make for a different definition of the state, actually. Okay, so I control all the violence. Guess what? I can control the information if I want to. There might be taboos from the priesthood or something. Maybe I have charisma, maybe I don't, but whatever, okay. No, the individual charisma is not criterial for something to be a state. What are you talking about? But anyway, so like this is not working out definitionally in a basic competence philosophically. They shouldn't do political theory in this vein, or they should do it much more thoroughly, okay? Like you've got to come off of the thousands of cases and into the definitions and the theories in relation to one another, why this is a better account of what a state is than the other 10 accounts of what a state is. Because it's not. It's cobbled together and jerry-rigged in a way that's actually going to mystify the origins of the state. The state has no origin. And that's going to make anarchism as anti-statism senseless, right? That's pretty far from where it was. Reducing political power ultimately only to the first of these paradigmatic forms, force of domination, is, they repeat over and over, terribly simplistic. It seems to me that the state is itself becoming something of a shop-worn concept, Graeber says in On Kings. Debate about its origins, quote, almost always assume that the state is just one thing. And then in speaking of the origins of the state, one is necessarily also speaking of the origins of urbanization, written literature, law, exploitation, bureaucracy, science, and almost anything else of enduring importance that happened between the dawn of agriculture and the Renaissance, aside perhaps from the rise of world religions, unquote. This is a mistake, he says, because the state, quote, the state would be better seen as an amalgam of heterogeneous elements, often entirely separate origins, that happen to have come together in certain times and places and now appear to be in the process of drifting apart. Of course, something like that can have an origin, though. No doubt does, even if this were right. But anyway, this simplistic conception of the state as the monopoly of force is also the conception that fuels or articulates the anarchist critique of the state, from William Godwin to Mikhail Bakunin to Emma Goldman. As I put it in my book, Against the State, state power rests on violence and coercion. Violence and coercion, to be defensible, require a moral justification. Social contract theory and all the other attempts in this regard are pathetically inadequate. Therefore, there should be no political state. In late Graeber, this looks simplistic and non-empirical. The state is a concept that falls apart under analysis and should be abandoned? Should it be abandoned, or is it a three-part thing? Of course, that makes anti-statism just as senseless. For what is an anti-statist fighting against, really? Well, I'll tell you, I would be an anti-statist and fight against individual charisma, monopoly of violence, and a monopoly of information. All right, well, certainly, all right. It's possible to have aristocracies, slavery, and extreme forms of patriarchal domination, even without a state. Like Graeber and Wengrow, somewhat puzzlingly, especially given Graeber's previous work. Monarchs, aristocracies, slavery without a state. And it's equally possible to maintain complex irrigation systems. I don't doubt that. Or develop science, and definitely science or abstract philosophy without a state, they say. So, what do we actually learn about human history by establishing that one political entity is what we would describe as a state and another isn't? Are there not more interesting and important questions we should be asking? Well, certainly there are other questions. But this one takes David Graeber well beyond or well before his previous anarchism. A fundamental line of argument in The Dawn of Everything suggests specifically that Graeber was developing towards something like liberalism by the end of his authorship. This will, of course, please some and annoy others. I'm in the latter camp, but I just want to acknowledge that liberal political philosophy might find an interesting new set of justifications and also interesting new versions and formulations in late Graeber. In any case, Graeber and Wengrow centrally argue that concepts such as individual rights and democratic decision-making procedures, so central to Enlightenment political thought, in fact originated in an indigenous critique by colonized people of the political arrangements of European powers. This will be familiar to anyone who's read the first chapter of Dawn of Everything. They make this vivid with the figure of Candy Aronk, died in 1701, a Wendat orator, possibly from what is now Michigan, whose challenges to Western political systems may well have been, there are a lot of may well have beens and almost certainlys in this book, influential on Diderot and Voltaire. This is an amazingly unconvincing line of argument, man. And plus, even if it were exactly true, I'm not sure what it shows exactly. Okay, I mean, I know what's intended to show, in my opinion, that liberalism is actually an indigenous critique of Western political arrangements. Okay, that'd be cool, but that is a pro-liberal position, right? Invented by the indigenous. Okay, this is a way of Diderot and Voltaire were definitely familiar with Locke and Hume now. This is a way of rehabilitating the concept of universal inherent individual rights and freedoms, this indigenous assignment, from the familiar claim that it's a Eurocentric artifact of colonial exploitation, and from the Marxist critique that the individualism of and other aspects of liberalism represent the official ideology of the bourgeoisie. Graeber and Wengrow suggest that such concepts in fact embody an attack on colonial exploitation and rising capitalism, made by the very people being exploited and destroyed, and made by Candy Aronk some 30 years after John Locke said exactly the same thing, like the whole thing. Right. Anyway, on this basis, they issue something like a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Graeber and Wengrow issue something like a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, let's think about how far that is from David Graeber's politics in 2005. Rather different than the United Nations version, but related to it as well. They enumerate 3 basic liberties: the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create or transform social relations. Now again, if you're going to say that there are exactly 3 basic universal human rights, and here's what they are, then you have to say why. Like, you just plucked this from a candidate's of 20, a list of 20 or 40, right? Why? Why are those the fundamental ones? What do they mean in detail, in application? Right? Again, like when you hit the theoretical nub, there's nothing there, man. It's just like boof, all right. I mean, I'm in favor of those freedoms: the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, the freedom to create social relations. Yeah, okay. I'm in favor of freedom of speech too, and religion, and movement, and yeah, well, that's in here, I guess. They seem to hold that these rights belong to every individual in any culture, the liberal essence of liberalism, in a bewildering yet in the end suggestive passage in their conclusion. Graeber and Wengrow write that, quote, our own intellectual traditions oblige us to use what is, in effect, oblige us, Graeber and Wengrow, to use what is in effect imperial language. And the language already implies an explanation, even a justification, for much of what we are really trying to account for here. That is, we're going right back to the language of domination because there's no other way to be, like the language of here's the way everyone should be and stuff like this. That is why, in the course of this book, we sometimes felt the need to develop our own, more neutral, dare we say scientific, list of baseline human freedoms and forms of domination. Neutral, scientific list of basic freedoms. All right, so if you're going to make a claim to science, then you've got to give the data or something, right? Like give the argument, dude, and the taxonomy, like what in comparison to other views. Why is this better than Locke? Well, it isn't. It is Locke. I don't think this is in keeping even with the vast panoply of political and economic arrangements that they themselves have just surveyed. Like the vast data in here does not resolve into exactly 3 fundamental freedoms or something. Okay. But I agree that the book makes use of imperial vocabulary, delineating the objective, irresistible political truths that all rational persons will allegedly arrive at by the end. It can't be Graeber, right? As to the idea that the freedoms and forms of domination that Graeber and Wengrow delineate are scientific, Turgot and Kant and whomever, Rousseau and Voltaire probably all said the same thing. But I wouldn't have thought that I'd hear that claim from Graeber, especially as there is no consideration in the book of other contenders for fundamental freedoms and no attempt to give foundational justifications for these or even to sort them out in relation to one another. Any priority when they come in conflict and stuff like the basic questions a philosopher would ask. Maybe they didn't have time to answer them. It's not that I think we should routinely violate one another's freedom to disobey, though that's going to need some elucidation. Like, can you have a law that it's okay to disobey the law? No. So the freedom to disobey is really going to be an interesting thing to tease out. Not that they do that at all. It's that I'm somewhat surprised to see this sort of universalism emerging from this sort of anthropology, which supports it thinly at best and is widely and wildly in tension with it at worst. Graeber was never a relativist, exactly, but casually applying the same 3 concepts to every culture that has ever existed seems incompatible with his previous vast respect for human differences and his earlier account of many of his own political positions. The persistent 3-ness, I just note, of the distinctions hints at a line of a priori reasoning which is anything but empirical. It starts to hit Hegelianism, Everything turns out into 3s or whatever. And you go like, if I had to take a crack at characterizing late Graeber's politics, I might say he seemed to be a mainline leftist or moving towards state socialism. In an excellent profile of Graeber in New York Magazine, Molly Fisher writes that at the end of his life, Graeber was active in the UK Labour Party. The reason I support Corbyn, or I'm happy about him, Graeber said in an interview, is because he's willing to work with social movements. Graeber, reports Fisher, had struck up a connection with John Macdonald, Corbyn's shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, in an effort to bring ordinary Britons into the workings of the government. Corbyn's communications director described Graeber as someone sparking the imagination for what's politically possible. Defending Corbyn from charges of anti-Semitism that in part led to the end of his leadership, Graeber recorded a video in Corbyn's defense. I think that's pretty far from where he was in 2000, really. Perhaps Graeber's political positions matured. Most of ours do, really, if we persist long enough. Or perhaps the empirical data itself drew him in different directions, or his collaborators affected his expressions of his positions, or affected his positions. Still, I wish we had a couple more books to see where this was going, and a couple of chances to hear Graeber's own interpretation of his own development in relation to his previous ideas. As it is, I'm left somewhat disheartened. that I'm disheartened that he left me here. I feel like. So maybe I'm misinterpreting this. I kind of hope so, but and maybe I need a third reading. But it just seems like a lot of self-betrayal here to me in David Graeber, which makes me sad because I loved his thinking up until this moment. All right. That's that one.